Historians often begin their studies of the Crusades with the famous expedition to Jerusalem between 1095 and 1099. To many, this seems like the natural starting point. But in truth, this is an illusion, one shaped by the abundance of chronicles that describe this single campaign in great detail. The vivid accounts of soldiers, priests, and chroniclers have cast a strong light on the Jerusalem Crusade, making it appear as if nothing important came before it. Because of this, people often believe that the First Crusade was the only kind of crusading that existed in the 11th century. Over the years, many histories of the Crusades have followed this same narrow view, focusing almost entirely on the journey to Jerusalem. Yet the real story is much broader. The movement to Jerusalem was just one part of a larger world of crusading, a world that stretched across the Mediterranean and involved many different campaigns and ideas. However, traditional views of history resist this wider understanding. They continue to treat the Jerusalem Crusade as the clear starting point, rather than seeing it as part of a greater, more complex picture that was already in motion before 1095. For centuries, historians have viewed the Crusades through a narrow lens, one centered entirely on Jerusalem. This way of thinking treats the First Crusade, the march to Jerusalem, as the model and measure of all other crusades. Every later expedition, from Spain to the Baltic, has been compared to that single event. The Jerusalem campaign has become the standard, the blueprint, and the reference point for understanding what a crusade should be. But this view creates a false impression, as if the idea of crusading was born fully formed, complete with papal approval, vows, crosses, and promises of salvation. It suggests that everything began at once, when in reality, the institution of crusading evolved gradually over time. The early Crusades were living events before they ever became a formal system with rituals, symbols, and laws. In truth, the history of the Crusades has been trapped in the shadow of Jerusalem. Like being caught in a single swirling vortex, historians have circled endlessly around one event, unable to see that the crusading spirit first appeared in many different places and forms. The First Crusade was not an isolated miracle, but part of a broader movement, one that took shape across the Mediterranean long before 1095. If we truly wish to understand the Crusades, we must look beyond the single story of Jerusalem and explore how people of that time saw these events themselves. Some, like Pope Urban II, never imagined that he was creating something entirely new. To him, the Jerusalem expedition was only one step in a larger transformation already unfolding across Christian and Muslim lands, a shift of power, faith, and identity that was taking place in his own lifetime. From his point of view, crusading did not begin with one call to arms. It began with a series of struggles and movements that were part of a greater historical tide. To grasp the Crusades as they truly were, we must leave behind the idea of one crusade defining them all. Instead, we must listen to the many voices of the time, each seeing and interpreting events from their own perspective. Only then can we understand the Crusades not as a single story, but as a collection of human experiences connected by faith, conflict, and the search for meaning. The true meaning of crusading, as Pope Urban understood it, began with a great shift in power, the slow turning of the Mediterranean world from Islamic to Christian rule. This change did not start in Jerusalem, but much earlier, shaped by the ambitions and struggles of powerful Islamic states. In the late 10th century, the Fatimid Caliphate, ruling from North Africa, conquered Egypt and turned eastward, hoping to unite the Islamic world under a single Shia leader. But this dream never came true. Their advance was blocked by Byzantine strength in Syria and by internal revolts. As the Fatimids focused on the east, they abandoned their influence in the central and western Mediterranean, leaving behind a power vacuum that would soon be filled by rising Christian forces. In these western regions, the balance of power began to change. Muslim fleets and armies had once dominated the Mediterranean, conquering Sicily and raiding the Italian mainland. Yet by the 10th and 11th centuries, their control weakened. The Christian world began to push back. Papal and Byzantine forces drove the Muslims from central Italy, while in Sicily, North Africa, and Spain, local Muslim rulers grew divided and weak. The Norman Duke Robert Guiscard saw an opportunity and, with the blessing of the Pope, invaded Sicily. In Spain, Christian kings began to reclaim lands, city by city, after centuries of Islamic rule. Across the Mediterranean, from France and Italy to Iberia, Christian coalitions formed to fight back, a wave of holy war long before the call for the First Crusade. These conflicts, from Sardinia to Toledo, were not isolated events. They were all part of a single movement, a transformation in which Christian powers gained the upper hand as the Islamic world struggled with division and decline. The Church, seeing this great change, began to interpret it as part of a divine plan. Reforming popes like Gregory VII and Urban II did not invent the idea of crusading from nothing. Instead, they gave religious meaning to what was already happening. The steady reconquest of Christian lands and the reawakening of Christian power across the Mediterranean. Pope Urban II saw this transformation as the work of God, a transfer of power and destiny, what he called translatio regni, the passing of the kingdom. To him, the victories of his time were a sign that a new era had begun. In Spain, the capture of Toledo symbolized this rebirth. Urban spoke of history as a cycle. First, a time of greatness, then, a fall into sin and conquest, and finally, repentance and restoration. What had once been lost to Islam was now being reclaimed. For Urban, this was more than a political change. It was the fulfillment of divine prophecy, a renewal of Christian strength after centuries of decline. Thus, the story of the Crusades did not begin in 1095 with a single call to arms. It began with a century-long turning of the tide, a chain of wars, reconquests, and faith-driven struggles that reshaped the Mediterranean world. When Pope Urban finally called for the First Crusade, he was not creating a new movement. He was giving voice to one that had already begun, linking distant battles into a single, sacred story of restoration. Pope Urban II read the events of his own time through the lens of Scripture and used that vision to guide action. He believed the past and the present were joined, that the meaning of ancient prophecies was unfolding in his day. By linking the transfer of power described in the book of Daniel to what he saw across the Mediterranean, he became not only an interpreter of history, but also a leader who tried to shape it. Urban looked backward to understand the present and forward to sketch the future. He saw Christian territories once lost to Islam beginning to return to church rule. Victories and restorations in his lifetime, he believed, marked the end of an old era and the birth of a new one. From these signs, he drew a plan. First recover lands, then rebuild church institutions, and finally spread the faith outward. He set this pattern early. After Toledo was retaken, Urban restored its church to honor and urged its archbishop to live worthy of that office and work for the conversion of Muslims through word and example. For Urban, warfare, rebuilding, and evangelization were not separate stories. They were stages of one enterprise. Each stage prepared the way for the next. Only after places were secured and churches restored could preaching take root and endure. Other great churchmen shared this outlook. Anselm of Canterbury wrote that the church in Jerusalem had been raised to life again so that the faith might spread from there to the whole world. Hugh of Cluny championed the same vision, tying conquest, restoration, and mission together in sermons, councils, and art. Their message matched the popular hope of the age, not only to win battles, but to convert hearts. Modern writers sometimes draw a hard line between crusade and mission. Urban and his contemporaries did not. In their eyes, the crusade to take back cities, the work of rebuilding altars and sees, and the call to preach were parts of a single movement. The aim was not war for its own sake, but renewal, order, and the expansion of the Christian message. This was the horizon Urban set before his world: recover, restore, and then proclaim. Pope Urban II did not invent the Crusades, but he gave them a clear theory and a working plan. He used the idea of a transfer of power to explain why these wars mattered and how they should be carried out. This vision joined belief and action. It showed people what the Crusades meant and how to move forward. Earlier popes had planted the seeds. Urban widened the scope to the whole Mediterranean and turned scattered efforts into a more unified movement. Even so, crusading was never a simple religious machine. It did not run on faith alone. Kings, counts, and city leaders acted for many reasons: defense, honor, trade, and power. They fought to serve Christendom, but also to serve their own states. Sometimes they worked with the papacy. Sometimes they resisted it. In the real world, crusading followed the pull of politics, wealth, and military need. Urban's great achievement was to give these mixed motives a common language and a shared purpose. After his call in 1095, Urban worried that all energy would rush only toward Jerusalem. He feared that Iberia and other fronts would be ignored. He argued that the fight with Islam had many theaters and that all mattered. He urged Catalan lords to fulfill their vows at home by rebuilding Tarragona. He released a Spanish archbishop from a vow to go east so he could protect his own church. His message was simple: do not free Christians in one place while abandoning them in another. The Norman conquest of Sicily shows how this worked in practice. It began under a powerful duke, not under papal command. Only later did the papacy shape the effort with blessings and spiritual rewards. In Spain, popes encouraged campaigns like Barbastro and later supported local vows and indulgences. As pressure grew, leaders such as El Cid took cities, secured churches, and sought papal recognition to legitimize new rule. Charters from Valencia present him not as a mere adventurer, but as a sovereign who saw his victories as part of God's plan and the wider transfer of power. By the end of the 11th century, Christian powers were pushing forward on many shores. Urban's framework tied these fronts together: recover lands, restore the church, and then spread the faith. The Crusades were driven by hard realities, but ideology gave them shape. Urban's vision made a scattered series of wars into a larger story of change across the Mediterranean, a story that rulers could join for their own aims, yet still see as part of a shared cause. The 1098 Charter does more than list lands and witnesses. It builds a public case that Rodrigo Diaz, the Cid, ruled Valencia by right under God. After the endowment lines and formal threats to anyone who might break them, The text bears Rodrigo's own confirmation with his wife, names the witnesses, and credits the scribe. Yet its real power lies in the vision it presents. It places the Cid inside a grand story about how God moves power on earth, joining the past to the present and tying Valencia to the wider renewal of the Church. The charter lays out a four-step pattern that Pope Urban also used. First comes the Christianization of Iberia and a long season of peace. Then a calamity strikes, and both crown and church fall under the sword of the newcomers. Third, God raises a champion, Rodrigo the Campeador, who wins victories, takes Valencia, and restores public worship. Fourth, the city's great mosque is consecrated as a church, a bishop is installed, and a working church structure is rebuilt. In this telling, the Cid is not only a war leader, he is the agent through whom Christian rule and Christian rights return. At the heart of the charter is a single principle. God holds kingship over the nations and gives rule to whom he wills. The text links the change of priesthood and kingship in Scripture to the change of power in Iberia. It argues that God chooses places and people for mercy and mission. That is why the charter ties the restoration of the Valencian Church to the spread of the Christian faith. The Cid's victories are framed as acts achieved with divine help, so that a ruined see can live again. This is where Valencia and Rome meet. The charter names Urban as the Roman Pope and shows him acting in a decisive way. He personally consecrates Bishop Jerome and, by doing so, frees Valencia from the control of Toledo. That move gives the Cid an independent church to match his independent principality. It turns his practical rule into recognized sovereignty. For the Pope, it is a new tactic that supports those rulers who seem raised up for the work of liberation and rebuilding. Urban's wider strategy also takes shape here. He does not want all strength to flow only toward Jerusalem. He urges leaders in Iberia to fight and to repopulate key cities. He celebrates fresh gains in Aragon. He supports Valencia's autonomy when larger powers falter. The aim is to keep pressure on many fronts across the Mediterranean. The charter reflects this approach. It treats the Cid's success not as an isolated feat, but as part of a chain of similar transfers from Islamic to Christian rule. In later centuries, many historians misunderstood who the Cid truly was. Some described him as a Muslim-style ruler, a Taifa lord, or even a sultan of Valencia. Others thought of him as a mercenary with little religion, or simply a man driven by power and gold. But the historical truth is very different. Rodrigo Diaz was not a Muslim ruler or a Christian imitation of one. He was a Christian leader who created and ruled an independent Crusader state, a principality born in the heart of a religious and political struggle between Christianity and Islam. Modern scholars often try to fit him into the idea of the Spanish Reconquest, as if he were an early nationalist fighting for a future Spain. But this is a mistake. In the 11th century, there was no Spain as we know it today. The Cid's wars were part of a much wider movement that stretched across the Mediterranean, a series of crusading efforts to reclaim Christian lands and rebuild churches. His conquest of Valencia was a holy and political mission at once, to restore Christian rule and re-establish the church as the heart of the city's life. Muslim writers of the time also recognized this. They noted that after the fall of Valencia, many inhabitants converted to Christianity, seeing in the Cid's victories the power of his faith. Though he was not a saint, he saw himself as fighting with divine help. His successes on the battlefield convinced many that God was with him. In this, he shared the same belief that guided later kings like James I of Aragon, who centuries afterward would also conquer Valencia and restore Christian worship there. For the people of his age, the Cid's triumphs carried deep religious meaning. His Charter of 1098, his rebuilding of churches, and his alliance with the papacy all showed that he saw his rule as part of a divine mission. His victories were not only military, but spiritual, proof of God's favor. This is why his story spread far beyond Iberia, inspiring the great epic Poema de Mio Cid and shaping the medieval image of a Christian hero chosen by God. Some modern historians argue that the Crusades were simply struggles for land, trade, and power, led by ambitious rulers who used religion as a mask. They imagine medieval warriors as professionals who shared more in common with their enemies than with their priests. While such exchanges and moments of peace did exist, this view misses the deeper truth. In the Middle Ages, religion was not a decoration or an excuse. It was the core of identity. Whether Christian or Muslim, people saw themselves first through their faith. Every war, alliance, and kingdom was understood within that sacred frame. In this world, the Cid's story makes perfect sense. He fought not only for power, but for God's order on earth. His Principality of Valencia was a symbol of a larger transformation taking place across the Mediterranean. The transfer of lands, power, and belief from Islamic to Christian rule. In that sense, the Cid was not an isolated warlord, but part of the same great movement that reshaped both faith and empire in his age. To understand the Crusades, we must first see two great communities: the Christian people of the Latin West and the Muslim community founded by the Prophet. Their struggle did not begin in 1095. By the late 11th century, it enters a new phase: Christian reconquest, restoration, and evangelization. Pope Urban II reads this change in real time. He looks at rulers who recover cities, rebuild churches, and protect believers, and he sees champions of the faith. Among them, he counts the Cid of Valencia. Urban backs words with action. He helps make Valencia truly independent by supporting the Cid's control of the local church and protecting it from outside interference. He grants privileges that secure the new order, just as he supports other leaders who push back Islamic power across the sea. In doing so, he turns scattered wars into a connected project that joins belief and policy. Why does the papacy lead this movement? Because it can speak across borders. The old empire no longer holds the West together. The popes claim independence from secular control and seek new allies among rising powers. In return for papal recognition and church structures of their own, these rulers accept a larger mission: to restore lands once Christian, to reorganize them as Christian provinces, and to fold them back into Christendom. Rome can appeal to a common conscience that kings alone cannot reach, and so it forges coalitions that act from Sicily to Iberia to the eastern Mediterranean. To grasp Urban's ideas, we should use his own terms. He calls this vast change a transfer of power, the shift from Islamic to Christian rule across the Mediterranean. He defines crusading by what is happening in his time, not by a single march to Jerusalem. He watches how rulers act, how churches are rebuilt, how people return to Christian worship, and from these living facts he builds his theory. In his view, crusading is not one event, but a web of actions that move together. The early Crusades are many-shaped. Some are great campaigns, others are small restorations, like rebuilding a ruined monastery. They feed one another. First comes reconquest, then comes rebuilding the church, Then comes preaching and conversion. Later, settlement and long-term rule take form. Seen this way, the Crusades are not a fixed object on a pedestal, but a changing force. They are united by a single story. An old era ends, a new era begins, and power, faith, and community are carried from loss back to life. Women and the Crusades were not separate worlds. Many churchmen warned that women should not take part. They feared sexual sin and blamed defeats on temptation. Some even said women could not truly be cross-signed. Yet the record tells a different story. Queens and noblewomen led, governed, and shaped events. Melisande ruled Jerusalem. Teresa of Portugal and Urraca of Leon and Castile led wars in Iberia that popes treated as crusades. Matilda of Tuscany backed the reforming popes and helped launch an attack on Almadia. Their lives show that women stood at the center of power and holy war. Evidence for women on crusade exists across 2 centuries. Many took the cross. Many more traveled, organized, raised money, and urged men to go. Preachers sometimes said wives held husbands back, but charters and family links often show the reverse. Women encouraged recruitment, paid for ships and supplies, and turned private vows into public action. When a queen or princess supported a campaign, the effect spread through cities and courts. Even after the fall of Acre, women still promoted new efforts. Most women did not fight, and most men did not either. From the 13th century, the papacy pushed non-warriors to commute vows into money unless they could lead troops. Still, women went east with families and households. Queens traveled with kings. They managed diplomacy, carried dowries, and guarded strongholds. When Louis of France was captured in Egypt, Margaret of Provence directed the defense of Damietta while in childbirth. In other cases, women helped the armies in practical ways. They brought water to the lines, carried food, filled ditches, and cared for the wounded. War put them at risk. Sources mention women killed at Antioch, Acre, and Damietta. Writers shaped these stories to teach morals. Clerics often pictured women as saints or sinners and ignored other roles. Muslim authors also used women to make a point about the enemy. Yet if we read carefully, we see real work and real danger. Some Muslim accounts describe Christian women using bows or urging men to fight. Christian accounts focus less on women in combat, but they do record women commanding towns and castles. Lady Eschiva held Tiberias. Sibylla and Isabella stood for Jerusalem and Tyre. They issued orders and directed defenses even if they did not fight with weapons in the field. There were women commanders on the Muslim side as well. Shajar al-Dur, once a slave and then Sultana of Egypt, managed the state during a French attack. She hid the Sultan's death to keep morale, coordinated the army, and held the realm together until a successor arrived. After victories and a royal ransom, she briefly ruled before the emirs forced a change. Her story shows how a woman could lead in crisis, even inside a system built for men. So, did women matter in the Crusades? Yes. They recruited, financed, governed, negotiated, supplied, healed, and defended. Their roles were limited by custom and law, and our sources are biased and uneven. But across the Mediterranean world, from palaces to campfires, women helped make crusading possible. On the road, at the walls, and in the councils where war and peace were decided. During the age of the Crusades, women did not disappear from the story. Many traveled to the Holy Land as pilgrims, and some took the cross as a sign of faith and devotion. Queen Margaret of Hungary, sister to the King of France, journeyed to Jerusalem after her husband's death and spent the rest of her life in Acre, serving the church. She was called a Crusader, though she never fought in battle. Yet others, like Margaret of Beverley, found themselves in the middle of war. She carried water to the soldiers defending Jerusalem during Saladin's siege in 1187, was captured after the city fell, and endured slavery before finally returning home to become a nun. Her story shows both courage and suffering, women living through the same hardships as the men around them. Some tales go even further. Hildegund, a young German girl disguised as a boy, traveled on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and lived for a time among the Templars before returning home to join a monastery. Her disguise symbolized the courage and faith that allowed her to cross boundaries forbidden to women of her time. Later legends told of English women who fought at Rhodes, one said to have killed hundreds of Turks, another named Lucy, who fought in the 1480 defense of the island. These stories may have been exaggerated, but they reveal how deeply people admired the image of a devout woman defying fear and standing firm in the face of danger. In reality, women were rarely spared from the violence of holy war. Many were captured, enslaved, or killed, whether Christian or Muslim. The Crusades blurred all lines of safety. Even noblewomen were not immune. Girauda of Lavaur, a lady of southern France, was thrown into a well and stoned during the Albigensian Crusade. Yet there were also moments when women changed the course of battles. In 1218, during the siege of Toulouse, Simon de Montfort was struck and killed by a stone launched by the city's women, wives, mothers, and daughters defending their homes. Chronicles saw divine justice in this act, that God had chosen the weak to humble the mighty. Elsewhere, stories of women warriors continued. In Aragon, a woman named Na Mercadera fought with shield and lance, capturing a French knight during the crusade against her homeland. In Prague, during the crusade against the Hussites in 1419, women fought side by side with men, throwing stones and lances from the walls until many died in defense of their city. Their bravery became part of Czech national memory, a symbol of faith and resistance. Even in the far north, in Prussia and Livonia, chronicles tell of women fighting beside men against pagan or Christian foes, sometimes killing their captors, sometimes dying as martyrs. Across these centuries, one truth stands out. In the wars of faith, there were no true bystanders. Women suffered, fought, prayed, and endured. Some became symbols of devotion, others of defiance. Whether queens commanding from palaces or pilgrims caught in sieges, they too carried the cross, often not as warriors, but as witnesses to the human cost of holy war. In the time of the Crusades, most women did not take up arms, but many played vital roles in defending Christendom through wealth, faith, and service. The Church taught that women could fulfill their vows by funding others to fight in their place. Yet some were rich enough to send soldiers of their own. One such woman was Countess Alice of Blois, who traveled to Acre in 1288 with her own army and built a defensive tower against Muslim attacks. Women like her turned faith into action by using their resources to strengthen the Christian world. Across medieval Europe, women of wealth and influence used their power to support the Crusades. In Genoa, noblewomen invested in trade, owned property, and gave large donations to crusading campaigns. Many left money in their wills to support holy wars overseas. Others stayed home to manage family estates and businesses while their husbands were away, keeping the economy alive and ensuring the survival of crusading families. But their position was not secure. With their husbands gone, wives and daughters were often left unprotected against legal disputes or violence. Some had to sell their dowries or go to court just to claim their rights. Behind the glory of crusading, there were women struggling to hold families and lands together. Women also supported the Crusades through prayer. The Church encouraged public processions where men and women prayed separately for victory in the Holy Land. During major campaigns, such as those led by the kings of Castile and France, women joined in regular prayers, fasting, and giving alms for the success of Christian armies. Their devotion was seen as spiritual warfare, a battle fought through faith rather than swords. Another important way women helped was through the great military religious orders, such as the Knights Hospitaller and the Teutonic Order. These groups cared for pilgrims, defended Christian lands, and built hospitals. Women became donors, patrons, and even members, offering prayers and care for the sick. They did not fight, but they served as the heart and soul of the Christian effort, keeping its spirit alive even far from the battlefield. When Crusaders fell in battle, women also played a key role in preserving their memory. Wives and mothers built churches, commissioned chronicles, and made sure the names of their loved ones lived on. Some thinkers even imagined new ways women could help spread the faith through education, healing, and diplomacy. The idea that women could bring others to Christianity through wisdom or compassion echoed in stories of saintly figures and devoted queens. Female saints became symbols of the crusading ideal. The Virgin Mary was revered as a protector of Crusaders, sometimes even described as a heavenly warrior. Other women saints were honored as models of courage and endurance. They gave the movement its spiritual foundation, the belief that faith, suffering, and sacrifice could shape history. The Crusades were wars fought in God's name, and that has drawn great attention and confusion. Not every Western war in the Eastern Mediterranean was a crusade, and not every battle was driven only by faith. There were moments of shocking fanaticism and massacre, but these were not constant. After fierce outbreaks, both sides often returned to exchanges of prisoners and rough versions of the laws of war known in Christian and Islamic worlds. Beneath the religious language stood practical limits. Both societies lived mainly on farming. Money, food, and horses were scarce. Rulers on each side could keep only small permanent forces and had to bargain or gather wealth to raise big armies. Campaigns were expensive, so leaders avoided unnecessary risks, accepted truces, and fought in short bursts. Even powerful rulers could not easily keep huge armies in the field for long. The two sides also fought with different styles. The Turks brought steppe warfare, fast horse archers, sudden appearances, feigned retreats, and swarms of arrows. This worked well on the open plains. Western forces relied on heavy cavalry and tight formations. When they held their line and chose the right moment to charge, close-quarter combat could break lighter troops. Over time, Muslim armies increased their heavy cavalry to meet this challenge while keeping their mobility. Western warfare at home was agro-urban. Power centered on castles and towns. Armies were built from many small retinues, slow to move and focused on sieges and ravaging the countryside. Command was loose because political authority was scattered. In the First Crusade, the newcomers learned quickly. They used rearguards, ambushes, infantry screens, and stronger formations to withstand arrows and strike when it mattered. The Latin settlers in the east adapted even further. They filled the land with stone castles that anchored defense and supply. In the field, they used the fighting march, keeping knights protected by infantry until the chosen moment for a decisive mass charge. They recruited local light cavalry called Turcopoles, though in limited numbers. Most of all, the military orders, temple and hospital, created disciplined standing forces, something unusual for the age, and built major fortresses that stiffened the frontier. Strategy was a contest of sieges, raids, and timing. Strong walled cities on the coast gave the Kingdom of Jerusalem depth and resilience. An invader who stopped to besiege a city risked being attacked by the field army and harassed by nearby castles. Saladin's rise changed the balance through unification, but even his great victories required rare political alignment and careful concentration of strength. Setbacks like Montgisard hurt his prestige, while successes like Jacob's Ford shifted momentum back. From the 1170s to the 1180s, pressure mounted. Truces came and went. Raids burned fields and tested borders. Kerak drew repeated attacks. Jacob's Ford marked a turning point, after which fighting more often took place on Christian ground. The Third Crusade showed again how limits of money, distance, and politics shaped events as much as belief. Reynald of Chatillon's raid in 1184, which struck pilgrims on the road to Mecca, shocked the Muslim world and increased the pressure on Saladin. Saladin's counter-campaigns were hard and costly, but they put steady strain on the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In 1184, the Latin leaders begged Europe for help and received money but no large army. Raids, sieges, and sudden clashes damaged fields and towns and deepened arguments among the Franks about what to do next. Most battles were not carefully planned. They were encounters shaped by luck and quick decisions. By the mid-1180s, Saladin understood that to break his enemies, he had to destroy their field army in open battle. He believed that if he lost, his wide realm could still absorb the blow. But if he won, his fame as Islam's champion would rise. On the Frankish side, King Guy of Jerusalem needed a victory to unite his hostile lords. Both sides were ready to risk everything. That is why Hattin happened, and why the Third Crusade and the Battle of Arsuf followed soon after. In late 1186 or early 1187, Reynald broke the truce and seized a caravan between Egypt and Syria. Saladin used this to end the peace. Guy's rival, Raymond of Tripoli, made his own deal with Saladin and let Muslim forces cross his lands to raid the kingdom. On the 1st of May, 1187, a Muslim column slaughtered a small Frankish force in Galilee, many of them Templars. This loss was terrible, as Saladin was gathering a huge army near Damascus. At the end of June, he crossed the Jordan, camped near Kafr Sabt, and besieged Tiberias, hoping the Franks would march out to fight. The kingdom mustered about 18,000 men around Safari, with 1,200 knights at the core. Their leaders argued through the night. Some urged caution and supply line defense. Many knights demanded a fight. Though they first chose to hold position, Guy changed his mind at dawn on the 3rd of July and advanced. The army moved in 3 great blocks along the Roman road, knights at the center of each box, infantry and archers around them to shield the horses from arrows. Heat, dust, and distance stretched their line and made command difficult. By noon, the Franks reached the spring at Turan. If they had stayed, they could have threatened Saladin while keeping access to water. Instead, Guy pushed up onto the dry plateau toward Hattin. Saladin cut them off from the spring and harried the rear. The Franks halted near a small pool at Mascana, hemmed in on every side. During the night, fire and thirst broke their spirit. At dawn on the 4th of July, their infantry fled to the twin hills called the Horns of Hattin. The knights, exposed and exhausted, could not deliver a clean, decisive charge. Leadership failed. The Muslim army was vast, coordinated, and patient. Twice the Frankish charge nearly broke through, but Saladin held firm and then closed. The army of Jerusalem collapsed. Hattin did not automatically end everything, but it broke the kingdom's field army. Many cities surrendered. Yet Tyre held out, and Saladin did not destroy every stronghold. He lacked the constant power to finish the job at once, and the risk of Western relief was real. That relief came with the Third Crusade. Acre fell to the Crusaders in July 1191. Soon after, Richard the Lionheart began his march south to Jaffa, the key to any move on Jerusalem. Richard's army was smaller than the stories often claim, but it was seasoned and disciplined. He formed it in 3 blocks, with infantry shielding the cavalry. His fleet moved along the coast beside him, carrying water and supplies. On land, tired units could rotate to the seaside for rest. Saladin attacked constantly, trying to goad the column into breaking formation. The march became a moving fortress, iron against arrows. On the 7th of September, near Arsuf, pressure on the rearguard grew unbearable. The Hospitallers finally charged. Richard instantly supported them and unleashed a mass cavalry attack. The blow shattered parts of the Muslim line and sent many riders fleeing, though large numbers escaped and regrouped. Richard had won the field and secured Jaffa, but Saladin's army survived. Both Hattin and Arsuf show the same truths. Logistics and leadership mattered as much as courage. Close order discipline could blunt arrow storms. Massed charges could decide a moment, but not a war. After Hattin, Saladin gained much but could not strike Europe or hold every siege forever. After Arsuf, Richard gained room to negotiate but lacked the strength and unity to retake Jerusalem. He saw that Egypt was Saladin's treasury and argued for an Egyptian campaign. The army wanted Jerusalem, and political quarrels soon weakened the Crusader camp. In medieval warfare, conquest was slow. Armies were expensive, short-lived, and divided by competing interests. Chance could turn the tide in a single day. The First Crusade's triumph looked miraculous for that reason. Hattin looked the same from the other side. Yet neither side could impose a final decision until a new kind of force appeared. That force was the Mamluk army, a corps of highly trained professionals kept in a true standing army. The Mamluks defeated both the Latin settlers and the Mongols. Their rise showed what constant, organized military power could achieve when episodic feudal levies could not. From the First Crusade onward, many who went to fight did so for pay. Some received wages from the start, others later in the campaign. This practice spread across fronts in the Holy Land, Iberia, and the Baltic. Donors could fund a soldier in their place and gain spiritual rewards, and kings sometimes put whole paid units in the field. Money fiefs and royal stipends helped keep garrisons and patrols active along dangerous borders. Military orders relied on far more people than their own brothers. In major castles, the corps of knights and sergeants stood beside large numbers of Turco-Poles and crossbowmen. Field forces often contained a small group of brethren and a much larger body of hired men-at-arms. Records describe garrisons where a few dozen brothers commanded hundreds of auxiliary fighters. Losses in sieges show the same pattern. Many dead were non-brothers serving under the order's banner. Paid soldiers were only one part of a wider system. Orders also used unpaid vassals, short-term volunteer knights, and men sent as penance. Crusaders passing through might serve on castle duty for months, yet unpaid service was uncertain. Feudal duties were limited in time and distance, and some subjects were unwilling or legally exempt from fighting. In frontier zones, loyalty and reliability could not always be guaranteed. This pushed rulers and orders to rely more on wages when they needed troops at the right place and time. Identifying who was paid is not always clear in the sources. Many records simply list knights, sergeants, Turco-Poles, and foot soldiers without terms. Some Turco-Poles served for charity and received upkeep rather than a salary, while others drew regular pay or even held small fiefs. Senior officers kept Turco-Poles as orderlies and messengers, but most served as light cavalry and scouts. When great campaigns gathered, orders fed and maintained thousands of fighters each day, far beyond the number of brother knights they could field, which implies widespread hiring. Sometimes outside patrons funded men who served under an order's command. Kings left money to maintain set numbers of knights for years. Bishops, nobles, and towns paid for substitutes to fulfill obligations. In other cases, the orders themselves hired on the spot. Masters raised troops before invasions, took on stipendiary sergeants to hold key castles, and kept paid contingents at coastal strongholds. After major sieges, letters speak openly of wages spent on defenders and gunners. By the late 13th century, the mix of forces around the orders was well known. A small professional corps directing a much larger body of auxiliaries, many of them paid. Castle lists tally money fees to knights and sergeants. Chronicles note mounted archers sent at a patron's expense, and foreign crossbowmen kept on retainer. Even in the Baltic and Livonia, garrisons included men-at-arms from other regions who could not have been serving only out of duty. On islands and advanced posts, local archers and specialist troops fought for wages. In practice, crusading warfare needed cash as much as courage. Short feudal seasons, long distances, and constant siege work all demanded steady funding. The military orders became managers of this war economy, collecting gifts, spending on pay, and blending brother knights with hired professionals. This financial backbone helped hold walls, patrol frontiers, and field armies long after unpaid levies had gone home. By the late 13th century, the great military orders were under financial strain. Their flow of gifts and new estates in Western Europe slowed. Revenues from lands in the Holy Land disappeared as castles and towns fell. Tax breaks were reduced, while new royal and papal taxes rose. Letters from commanders in the East warned that without money, they might have to abandon their positions. There was also a shortage of people willing to serve far from home. Hiring soldiers became harder and more expensive. Commanders wrote that they now had to pay more for rations and for the risk of death, because fewer men would fight without high rewards. Paid soldiers came from many places. In Iberia and the Baltic, Western fighters joined for wages. In the Holy Land, some were hired in Europe and sent east. Others arrived on their own seeking pay. Some Turco-Poles were Westerners, but many were local Christians or converts who knew the land and fought as light cavalry or archers. There are also reports of Muslims fighting alongside Christian forces for pay, just as Christian mercenaries sometimes served Muslim rulers. On a frontier where alliances shifted and survival mattered, money often decided who fought for whom. Why hire at all when the orders had their own brothers? Wages cost more than supporting a brother, even though Turco-Poles received smaller rations. But the orders needed skills their brothers did not always have. Light horsemen who could scout and screen, crossbowmen who could hold walls and break charges, guides who knew the deserts and hill tracks. In some cases, there were not enough trained men inside the orders to fill these roles. Paying professionals solved immediate needs, especially during sieges or long campaigns. Most brothers actually lived in Western Europe, far from the front lines. They collected donations, ran farms, and managed houses that funded the war effort. Many were not trained for hard campaigning, and some were too old to fight. Proposals to move most brothers to the east rarely matched reality. The orders needed people at home to keep money and recruits flowing. When disasters struck, the leading orders could replace losses, but moving men across the sea took time. In the gap, they hired. Hiring was not just for emergencies. Castles needed permanent garrisons. Money fiefs bound knights and sergeants to serve for pay over time. Patrons in Europe funded set numbers of fighters for years. Towns and vassals sometimes sent substitutes and covered the cost. Masters raised stipendiaries to defend key fortresses and kept paid units at ports and island outposts. The mix was constant. A small corps of brothers directing a larger body of auxiliaries, many on wages. Unpaid service could not be trusted on schedule. Feudal duties were short and limited by distance. Some subjects were exempt or unwilling. In borderlands, loyalty could shift. When terms expired, men went home. To keep an army in the field through a season, commanders often paid to extend service beyond the normal limit. That is why payrolls grew during big sieges and major offensives, and why letters from the East speak of daily costs for thousands of mouths. Specialists were a key reason to hire. Before it became fully military, the hospital paid men to protect pilgrims on the roads. The temple in its early days paid sergeants before it developed its own ranks. Crossbowmen and Turcopoles were in high demand and not easy to recruit as brothers in large numbers. Western bans on certain weapons never stopped their use, but they limited the pool of trained archers. In practice, commanders bought the skills they needed when they needed them. The result was a war economy. Donations, rents, and taxes flowed into payrolls, rations, horses, and siege tools. Where brothers were few, wages filled the gaps. Where time was short, money bought speed. Even as revenues tightened and recruitment faltered, the orders tried to hold the line by mixing discipline, faith, and pay. It kept walls manned and patrols moving a little longer, even as the balance of power shifted against them. The story of the Crusades and the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is usually told as non-stop holy war. Books and films celebrate battles, saints, and heroes. Yet between 1096 and 1291, there were also long pauses of peace. Both Christian and Muslim rulers sometimes signed treaties. These agreements were legal, practical, and often the only way to recover from years of fighting. From the very beginning, leaders also made cross-religious alliances. Christian princes sometimes sided with one Muslim ruler against another. Muslim rulers sometimes used divisions among the Franks. Critics called this a betrayal of holy war, but to many rulers it was normal politics. This raises a hard question. When was a Christian-Muslim deal smart policy, and when was it treason? In the Latin East, law books tried to define this. One royal law code said that a vassal who took land with the help of Muslim forces against the king's will had committed treason and could lose his fief forever. Treason meant betraying the king who stood for the state. It could include armed revolt, plotting against the royal family, deserting in battle, converting to Islam, or using Muslim troops to seize or keep a fief. Another legal book repeated that seeking Muslim help to hold a fief was treason, even a capital crime. In theory, private alliances with the enemy crossed a red line. In practice, rulers still made peace and even forged alliances when they thought it necessary. Two early cases show how flexible this could be. In Antioch, Princess Alice sought help from the powerful Muslim leader Zengi to secure her rule. The royal court treated her envoy harshly and removed her from power, but she was not executed. Her punishment was exile and the loss of authority. In Jerusalem, Count Hugh of Jaffa rebelled against King Fulk and was accused of seeking Egyptian help. That should have been high treason. Yet when he fled and the case reached judgment, the sentence was only a 3-year exile. In both cases, dealing with the enemy was punished mainly as an attack on royal rights, not as a crime against all Christendom. The most famous test came just before the disaster at Hattin in 1187. Raymond of Tripoli had made a truce with Saladin while he served as regent. When court politics changed and Guy of Lusignan became king, Raymond refused to recognize him. His old truce now looked like a private pact with the enemy. He even allowed a one-day Muslim raid through his lands, which led to a brutal clash with Templars and Hospitallers. Many called this treason. Yet, soon after, Raymond reconciled with the king, did homage, and fought against Saladin. Some chroniclers still blamed him for Hattin. Others blamed Guy's leadership. The label traitor depended as much on politics as on law. Private negotiations could also unsettle grand strategy. Near the end of the Third Crusade, Conrad of Montferrat explored his own deal with Saladin. Richard the Lionheart's supporters denounced it as betrayal because it weakened Richard's position. When Richard himself later agreed to a truce with Saladin, he explained it as a necessary step with a promise to return. The difference was simple. A king could make peace for the realm. A private lord who bargained alone risked being branded a traitor. Across these examples, the pattern is clear. Peace and alliances were part of crusade politics from the start. Kings and lawful rulers could make treaties and justify them as temporary truces in a holy struggle. Private deals that ignored the king's authority were dangerous. Sometimes they brought exile or disgrace. Sometimes they were tolerated if they served a larger need. In the medieval Middle East, where states were fragile and loyalties complex, the line between pragmatism and treason moved with power, timing, and who had the right to speak for the realm. Treason in the Crusader world was not a fixed idea. What a king could do was not always allowed to his subjects. Rulers claimed the right to make war and peace. A private lord who crossed that line risked being called a traitor. Modern writers often praise Saint Francis as a lone peacemaker. The records from the time show something different. In 1219, near Damietta, Francis crossed the lines to meet the Sultan. He preached the Christian faith and then returned safely to the Christian camp. Some thought the Sultan treated him like a messenger. Soon after, a broad truce was offered. Church leaders refused it. Local nobles were divided. For eyewitnesses, Francis looked like a holy missionary, not a man making secret peace. He asked for no reward. He did not try to block the army's plan. He stood for faith, not for a private deal. Years later, King Louis landed in Egypt and repeated old mistakes. He rejected terms he could have taken and was captured with his army. When he returned to Acre, he still led with royal honor. Then he learned the Templars had opened talks with Damascus without his leave. He was furious. He did not call it treason in name, but he treated it as an attack on royal rights. He expelled the Templar marshal from the kingdom. The message was clear. Only the king decides war or peace. Earlier, princes and orders had sometimes made their own truces. In Antioch, a charter even allowed an order to make war or peace from its own castles. Templar and Hospitaller houses sometimes took tribute from nearby powers. When a strong king was present, he could stop this. When kings were absent, the habit returned. As the Mamluks grew stronger and the Latin kingdom grew weaker, separate treaties multiplied. Cities, lords, and orders each tried to save themselves. These deals showed a broken realm more than a guilty heart. Without a working center, it was hard to call such acts treason. Close to the end, mistrust poisoned even good warnings. The Templar master William of Beaujeu kept contacts with the Sultan, including safe conducts and money matters. Many suspected him and ignored his alarms about an attack. When the final siege came, the Templars fought and died in Acre. The fear had been wrong. Private channels can help or harm, but judgment depends on who holds power and how they use it. The pattern is constant. A king could make a truce and explain it as strategy. A subject who bargained alone could face exile or disgrace. Saints like Francis acted from faith, not from politics. Their mission did not cancel the crusade. Their stories were not acts of secret peace that undercut the army. In the Crusader states, there were few firm borders between public duty and private interest. Labels like traitor moved with the moment. In the end, treason was often in the eye of the beholder and in the hand of the ruler who claimed the sole right to make peace and war. The great military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, were born in the Holy Land. Their main purpose was to protect and support the Christian settlers and pilgrims in the East. But their power and wealth came from the West. Europe supplied them with money, weapons, horses, and new recruits. In return, these orders acted as bridges between the spiritual and the military worlds. The idea of a religious order that also fought in battle was new. It developed slowly and reached its mature form in the 13th century when the Church stopped approving the creation of new orders. The Templars and Hospitallers became powerful landowners. Across Europe, they received vast estates, donations, and castles. To manage this network, they created local centers called commanderies. Each commandery had a leader known as a commander or preceptor who supervised the order's lands and collected income for the cause in the East. These commanderies were grouped into larger regions called provinces or priories. This system allowed the orders to control their estates more efficiently. It was a major innovation of the 12th century and soon influenced other religious movements, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, who later divided their orders into provinces as well. The central headquarters of the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights were originally in Jerusalem and later in Acre until it fell in 1291. Their supreme leaders, called Grand Masters, lived in the East, but often sent envoys to Europe to organize financial aid. These representatives were known as Masters Beyond the Sea and were responsible for coordinating the western branches of the order. As time went on, their duties grew, and regional officers were established in countries like France, Spain, England, and Germany to handle administration and fundraising. In the West, the orders built a complex network. Their officers were known by many titles: masters, preceptors, procurators, or commanders, depending on local custom. Over time, their offices became more formal, and some even used official seals to show their authority. The local commanderies often acted independently, especially in distant lands, but all ultimately owed allegiance to the central master in the East. By the early 14th century, the Hospitallers had divided their territories into 26 main regions, known as priories. These stretched across Europe, from Italy and France to the British Isles, Spain, and Central Europe. The Templars had a similar structure, with provincial masters overseeing territories in France, England, Spain, Italy, Germany, and Hungary. When the Templars were dissolved in the early 1300s, most of their estates were given to the Hospitallers, who became even more powerful. The Teutonic Order developed slightly later, around 1190, and its focus shifted toward Northern and Eastern Europe. It built a vast state in Prussia and Livonia, and divided its lands into regional units called bailiwicks. These included provinces like Franconia, Saxony, Austria, and Bohemia in the German Empire, as well as outposts in the Mediterranean such as Italy, Sicily, and Cyprus. All three orders maintained strong links between East and West. Officers in Europe were required to report to their masters in the East, and representatives from each region attended the general chapters, great assemblies where important decisions were made. The system of provinces, commanderies, and annual meetings gave the military orders a level of organization and international coordination that was unmatched in the medieval world. Through this network, money, men, and supplies flowed steadily from Europe to the battlefields of the Holy Land, a reminder that behind every crusader, army stood a vast and disciplined machine that kept the dream of Christendom in the East alive for nearly 2 centuries. In the 12th century, the main supporters of the military orders in Western Europe were the lesser nobility. Because of this, both the Hospitallers and the Templars built their strongest networks in the Capetian and Angevin lands. French and Occitan were the common languages inside their houses. Provence became the key gateway to the Levant. The port of Saint-Gilles grew into a major hub for administration and shipping. Early gifts to the Templars also came from Champagne, since their first master, Hugues de Payan, was from near Troyes. Soon, nobles across France and the Plantagenet realms followed, and the order began to divide its western lands into regions with their own officers. From early on, the Templars worked with 3 large regions: Provence, Francia, with Champagne, and Angevin-Poitou. As donations grew, subregions were split off and placed under local masters. Provence covered Saint-Gilles, Arles, Avignon, Orange, Rouen, Richerange, Valence, Jalles, and Montpellier, and later smaller zones like Carcassonne, Rodez, Albi, Rouergue, Cahors, Toulouse, the Agenais, and Roussillon. Poitou, later styled Aquitaine, included Bordeaux, La Rochelle, Saintonge, Anjou, Touraine, and Brittany. In the 1180s, Limousin and Auvergne gained their own officer. Francia covered Paris and the Ile-de-France, Orléans, and separate bailiwicks for Brie, Picardy, Beauvais, Vermandois, Artois, Laon, and Reims, Burgundy, and Chalon-sur-Saône. Political change also forced adjustments. After 1204, Normandy came under a separate officer tied to Francia, while Brittany remained linked to Aquitaine. Borders with the empire meant little to these networks, so Francia also had bailiwicks for Flanders, Hainaut, Brabant, Lorraine, and the Franche-Comté. The Hospitallers developed in similar ways, though without a Western founder figure. Their early weight sat at Saint-Gilles, which first oversaw the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles before those areas gained their own leaders. A Hospitaller priory for Francia appears by the late 12th century, moving between Paris and Corbeil, and a new priory for Auvergne emerged in the early 13th century as the network matured. In England, civil strife under King Stephen drove many nobles to donate to both orders. By the 1140s, the Templars had a master for England, and by about 1180, the Hospitallers had a prior. Their main English houses stood in London, the Old and New Temple for the Templars, and Clerkenwell for the Hospitallers. The Templars sold farm surpluses from large estates like Temple Cressing and Witham, and built dense commandery clusters in counties such as Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Administration was flexible. Some estates were managed directly by the master for England, others by regional bailiffs. By the 13th century, both orders had separate officers for Ireland and Scotland, though these were often subordinate to the English head. This created political tension, especially when the Scottish officers swore fealty to the English king. On the Iberian Peninsula, both orders joined the Reconquista and competed with native orders like Santiago and Calatrava. The Templars and Hospitallers gained major castles, towns, and estates, not only on the frontiers, but also deep in the interior. The Templars first ran Catalonia, Aragon, and Navarre, together with Provence, reflecting shared culture and trade routes. Portugal soon had its own masters, followed by Castile and Leon. After the Albigensian Crusade, the Spanish lands were fully separated from Provence, and by 1240, Aragon and Catalonia had their own Templar master. The Hospitallers, for their part, built distinct priories for each Iberian kingdom. When the Templars were suppressed in the early 14th century, their Iberian lands did not all pass to the Hospitallers. In Portugal, they formed the Order of Christ, and in the Crown of Aragon, they helped create the Order of Montesa, while Catalonia became a separate Hospitaller priory. Italy was vital because of sea routes to the east. Early houses clustered in ports and along pilgrim roads, with Templar sites in Genoa, Albenga, and major communes like Milan and Vercelli. A provincial preceptor for Lombardy, often titled "For All Italy," oversaw the peninsula north of the Kingdom of Sicily, including Rome and papal lands. Sub-bailiwicks appeared around the March of Verona, Rome and Tuscany, and Lucca. In the south, the Kingdom of Sicily changed hands between Normans, Hohenstaufen, Anjou, and later Aragon, shaping the order's fortunes. In Central Europe, the Hospitallers formed two priories by the 1180s, one for Alemannia in the west and one for Bohemia in the east, including Austria, Moravia, and parts of Poland. The map was complicated by imperial and papal conflicts, regional loyalties, and language divides. Over time, the Hospitallers added bailiwicks such as Utrecht and Cologne in the north, and Oberland along the Upper Rhine. The Bohemian Priory, centered on Prague, held together despite tension between German and Slavic brothers. The Templars developed a master for Alemannia in the 13th century and looked east as they acquired lands beyond the Elbe and Saale. Attempts arose to form a separate province for Bohemia, Austria, Poland, and Pomerania as political pressures grew. Scandinavia and Hungary linked closely to these Central European networks. Hungary mattered because of overland routes to the east. Both orders held lands there, and the Templars owned key sites on the Adriatic coast. In Scandinavia, only the Hospitallers were firmly present with a small priory of Dacia and a few houses in Norway and Sweden. The Teutonic Order followed a different path. Founded later and anchored in the German world, it struggled to grow in the Levant and moved into Eastern Europe. Invited to Transylvania, then shifting to the Baltic, it conquered Prussia, absorbed the Sword Brethren in Livonia, and built a state. Administration there ran through landmasters for Prussia and Livonia, with commanderies beneath them and local officers in areas without convents. In Germany and around the Mediterranean, the Teutonic Knights created bailiwicks like the other orders. Conflicts between emperors and popes affected them deeply. Masters rose and fell depending on their loyalties, and at times rival leaders competed for control. German donations from princes, churchmen, and knightly families fueled Teutonic growth. A German master managed core regions such as Franconia and the Upper Rhine, and appointed bailiffs for Thuringia, Saxony, Alsace-Burgundy, Lorraine, Marburg, Franconia, Westphalia, and Saxony. This produced a four-level hierarchy in much of the empire: Grand Master, German Master, Regional Land Commander, and Local Commander. The Hospitallers in Germany later mirrored this structure, drawing on the same knightly social class for leadership. Until the early 14th century, the Teutonic Order still hoped to play a role in the Levant. This kept Italy vital to their plans. After the fall of Acre in 1291, they moved their headquarters to Venice. In 1309, Master Siegfried von Feuchtwangen shifted the seat to Marienburg on the Vistula in Prussia. The move was controversial, and his successor Karl von Trier was even pushed out of Prussia. Only later did the Grand Masters settle permanently at Marienburg. Around the Mediterranean, the order built its holdings with support from the Hohenstaufen and their allies, often working with Venice and facing opposition from Genoa and papal partisans. Sicily and southern Italy were central to this story. On Sicily, the order held assets in Messina and received the monastery of Santissima Trinità in Palermo in 1197. By the early 13th century, named preceptors oversaw Sicily and, later, Calabria as part of the wider Sicilian realm. In Apulia, the order ran major bases at Barletta and Brindisi, held the castle of Messagne, and governed the monastery of San Leonardo at Ciponto. From the 1220s, preceptors of Apulia appear by name and later carried the title of general or great preceptor, showing the region's growing weight. Further east across the sea, the order maintained a small network in the Peloponnese within the Principality of Achaia, focusing on Mosteniza and the Venetian ports of Modon and Coron. They created a separate preceptor of Romania by the 1230s. Plans to expand failed when key sites went to the Templars and when Greek reconquests rolled back Latin control. After Acre fell, Apulia, Romania, and Cyprus were briefly united under one senior preceptor, whose title sometimes included Sicily to reflect the wider kingdom, not only the island. In northern and central Italy, the Teutonic Knights sought stepping stones over the Alps and down to the Adriatic. They owned houses in Venice, Padua, Bologna, and Parma, though shifting city politics sometimes forced withdrawals. In Rome, they once held the Church of Santa Maria in Domnica for their agent at the papal court. Even when that was reassigned, they kept properties in papal towns such as Viterbo and Orvieto, plus a hospice near Arezzo. From the 1240s, a preceptor for Lombardy and the March of Treviso handled the northern belt, and later a land commander for Tuscia oversaw holdings in the Papal States. West of Italy, the order gained income points in Montpellier and Arles. In Spain, ties to Hohenstaufen, allies brought them estates near Toledo, between Valladolid and Zamora, and at Carmona by Seville. Two provincial leaders are known by name, showing that Spain, while modest in size for the order, had its own officers and fed men and money back into the wider network. The lifeblood of all the military orders was fundraising and logistics from the West. Alms collecting was organized by dioceses. Licensed collectors stayed in episcopal towns, often renting houses at first and buying later. This is why records sometimes show a late formal presence even where the orders had long operated. Major orders often stood side by side in big cities, while in smaller towns a single order usually dominated, depending on patrons and donors. Alms were not only coins. Weapons, horses, cloth, and other goods were gathered, shipped, or sold to fund the East. Ports and road hospices were critical links in the chain. Overland routes through Hungary declined after the Third Crusade, shifting traffic toward Venice and the Adriatic. From the Rhineland, travelers crossed the Alps to Genoa, Venice, Ancona, Brindisi, or Messina. From France, convoys went down the Rhône to Marseille and Aigues-Mortes. By the early 13th century, regular sailings from Marseille to the Levant grew under the care of the orders. Landed estates required local management. While the orders tried to avoid heavy administration by selling faraway plots when possible, they could not escape building a system in regions where money was scarcer. They appointed special envoys to act in ports and relied on trusted laymen to receive and secure donations. The great crises in the East taught a hard lesson. One-time gifts were not enough. From the later 12th century, the orders accepted permanent revenues in the West and sent fixed annual sums, called responsions, to the front. By the 13th century, these payments were set for each officer, though wars often disrupted transfers. Most Western income came from farming. The orders ran domain lands with servants and hired hands and collected rents from peasants. Fields produced grain, mills ground flour, woodlands gave timber and pasture, sheep supplied wool, salt and iron mattered in some districts. Surpluses in grain, wine, meat, leather, cheese, and wool were sold at market. The Templars even shipped Bordeaux wine to England. In great cities and trade zones, the orders used privileges to reduce tolls and fees. In Paris and London, the Templars and Hospitallers handled deposits and loans, moved funds across long distances, and sometimes used letters of exchange. In southern France and Italy, they more often partnered with merchant banks. In Aragon, the Templars themselves were active lenders. A typical administrative center included living quarters, a chapel, barns and stables, mills and ovens, workshops, and a wall. Some centers housed full convents of brothers. Others ran with a small resident team and linked out to dependent farms and urban houses. Counting only buildings can mislead. A single major house could manage many satellites, parishes, and even hospitals, and in some places held local jurisdiction. In principle, the orders did not fight Christians in the West. Their lands on exposed frontiers enjoyed church protection, discouraging raiders. They did take part in defensive campaigns against external threats and fought when they held lordship responsibilities. Parish churches were expensive but useful, allowing steady income through tithes in growing towns and giving founders prestige and protection. Hospitals were often entrusted to the Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights because of their famed care in the East. The Templars, though not a hospital order, also received some hospices as way stations for pilgrims. At times, secular rulers granted them legal powers, and even older monastic houses rich in lands. By the close of the 13th century, as the crusading front shrank and priorities changed, the military orders in the West blended more into ordinary religious life. Their houses remained engines of prayer, administration, and memory. Yet for centuries, these Western networks had been the supply lines of a vast project, moving men, money, and materials from farm and port to the frontiers of Christendom. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the military religious orders stood apart from other religious movements like the Cistercians, Dominicans, or Franciscans. Their mission was not centered on spiritual reform or preaching in the West. Their true purpose was to defend the faith through action. Yet, they still worked to strengthen their lands by founding new villages, towns, and castles, especially in Spain, Portugal, and the lands east of Germany. Most members of these orders were knights or servants, and in the case of the Hospitallers, also priests. Unlike the scholarly friars, few of them were educated clerics. Some even served Western rulers or church leaders, creating occasional conflicts of loyalty. Over time, their estates in the West became essential to both their spiritual mission and their economic survival. These lands funded the defense of Christendom and connected the orders across Europe through vast networks of support. Nobles and commoners alike could join as brothers, sisters, or donors, sharing in the prayers of the orders and sometimes choosing to be buried in their churches. Young noblemen who could not inherit family lands often entered the orders as squires or attendants, hoping for a life of honor in service to faith and warfare. However, everything changed after the fall of Acre in 1291. The great crusading dream began to fade. The Templars, whose only mission was fighting the enemies of Christ, were dissolved. The Hospitallers retreated to Rhodes, while the Teutonic Knights shifted their focus to the Baltic frontier. They continued to defend Christian lands and care for the sick, but their role in Europe was no longer the same. Though their organization and administration survived, they lost much of the spirit and uniqueness that had once made them the most powerful warriors of God. For almost 2 centuries, from the First Crusade in 1096 until long after the fall of Acre in 1291, the German crusading movement burned with passion and purpose. Yet, despite its long and often bloody history, it remains one of the least explored areas in English scholarship. Many historians have focused mainly on French and English crusaders, while German participation is often mentioned only as background. One reason is that most of the detailed studies on this subject exist only in German and are deeply tied to the complex political and cultural history of the medieval German Empire. In recent years, scholars have tried to re-examine Germany's role in the Crusades, especially during the time of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. His reign is one of the most discussed in medieval German history. Earlier, historians saw his crusade mainly as a political move, a way to restore peace between the empire and the church, and to strengthen his authority. Newer interpretations, however, show a more complex figure. Barbarossa's actions were deeply connected to the idea of honor of the empire, a sense of duty, dignity, and prestige that guided both his diplomacy and his wars. His decision to lead the crusade in 1187 must be understood within this world of imperial pride, knightly culture, and spiritual ambition. The call for the Third Crusade came at a time of great internal tension in the empire. While many nobles were inspired by the fall of Jerusalem to take the cross, Barbarossa himself had to face deep political crises before committing to the campaign. His conflicts with the papacy, rebellious archbishops, and divided princes threatened the unity of the empire. In 1187, these disputes reached a breaking point. Frederick's long feud with Pope Urban III, combined with uprisings by powerful churchmen like the Archbishop of Cologne, had left the empire unstable. Only when Gregory VIII became pope and sought reconciliation did the path toward crusade become possible. At the Imperial Assembly in Mainz in 1188, the atmosphere was charged with emotion. Nobles and knights pledged themselves to the cause of Jerusalem, and Barbarossa himself finally took the cross, declaring his intention to march east. For a brief moment, peace seemed to return to the empire. But this unity was fragile. Behind the ceremony and devotion, many of the same rivalries continued. When Barbarossa's massive army left Regensburg in May 1189, it carried not only the cross of Christ, but also the burdens of a divided empire. Barbarossa's death a year later, drowned in the rivers of Asia Minor, ended both his crusade and a chapter of German history. His army reached the Holy Land without its emperor, and although they fought bravely at Acre, the dream of imperial triumph faded. Yet the story of the German Crusades, full of faith, politics, and ambition, reveals a powerful truth: that the crusading spirit in the empire was not only about holy war in distant lands, but also about the struggle to bring order, honor, and unity to a restless medieval world. After Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's death during the Third Crusade, his son Henry VI quickly took control of the empire. Like his father, Henry dreamed of great power and unity, but his own crusade, launched shortly before his death in 1197, has long remained a subject known mostly to specialists. Many historians connect it with his efforts to make the empire hereditary rather than elective. But his crusade also reveals much about his ambitions and the political world he inherited. Henry's plans for the crusade came at a moment of uncertainty. Unlike Barbarossa, whose travels and court are well documented, Henry's movements and decisions are much harder to trace. Still, he relied on a strong system of loyal ministeriales, unfree knights who managed imperial lands and armies, and surrounded himself with men from this background rather than powerful princes. This shift gave him more direct control, but also isolated him from some of the great nobles of the empire. His reign was marked by a military tone. He had been knighted as a young man and valued chivalric ideals deeply. Even so, Henry's crusade was enormous. Despite spending much of his wealth on wars in Italy and the conquest of Sicily, he raised a vast force for the expedition to the Holy Land. Chroniclers describe endless lines of German knights gathering in Apulia to receive pay and arms. The emperor's ambition was clear. He wanted to retake Jerusalem and restore imperial glory. Yet behind the grandeur lay political tension. His insistence on securing the throne for his infant son angered many nobles, and while he planned for a great victory overseas, unrest was growing at home. The crusade itself was short and poorly directed. Henry died suddenly in 1197, and most of his army returned to Germany by the following summer. Leadership problems, rivalries among commanders, and the emperor's death turned what had been a grand imperial vision into a brief and uncertain campaign. Even so, Henry's court poets and artists tried to portray him as a heroic Christian emperor, comparing him to the ancient Maccabees and celebrating his rule as part of a divine mission to defend the faith. After Henry's death, the empire plunged into chaos. Rival kings, Philip of Swabia from the Hohenstaufen family and Otto IV from the Welfs, fought for the throne. When Innocent III became pope in 1198, he reshaped the idea of crusading, linking it more directly to political duty and loyalty to the church. Under Frederick II, Henry's son, crusading became an even more complex issue. Frederick twice vowed to go to the Holy Land, at his royal coronation in 1215 and at his imperial coronation in 1220, but delayed for years. When he finally fulfilled his vow in 1228, he did so while excommunicated. Crusading had by then become a major state affair. It was not only a matter of faith, but also a demonstration of royal power and diplomatic skill. The German emperors organized great assemblies, or diets, to prepare their armies, collect funds, and negotiate with nobles. Yet many records from these gatherings are lost, leaving historians with only fragments. We know that Barbarossa held at least 9 major diets between 1187 and 1189 to prepare for his crusade, but the details of his planning remain unclear. The logistics of the German Crusades were vast and complicated. Armies had to be raised from across the empire, supplied with food, equipment, and ships. Some nobles followed the emperor's land route through the Balkans and Anatolia, while others sailed directly to the Levant. Knights formed the backbone of these forces, but craftsmen, soldiers, and townsmen provided crucial support. The Crusades also encouraged the growth of military orders like the Teutonic Knights, who became powerful symbols of German involvement in the Holy Land. In the end, the German Crusades were more than distant wars for Jerusalem. They were also expressions of imperial ambition, political struggle, and the desire to unite faith and power. Under Barbarossa, Henry VI, and Frederick II, the crusading ideal became a mirror of the empire itself. Grand, disciplined, deeply religious, but always divided by the very forces it sought to control. Here we step away from emperors and courts and look at crusading from the ground up. Power in medieval Germany was spread across cities, lords, abbeys, and guilds. War could be organized without an emperor at the center. The Fifth Crusade shows this clearly. So does the movement called the Children's Crusade in 1212. When we shift our view to local devotion, vows, preaching, and regional identity, German crusading looks less like a single imperial project and more like many overlapping energies. On the Baltic frontier, crusade also meant conversion and colonization. The idea moved north and east, took on new goals, and grew a different moral language from the Jerusalem Wars. Literature helps us hear how people imagined this world. German romances and lyrics preserved memory, reshaped ideals, and pushed noble aggression to distant stages. Writers like Wolfram von Eschenbach and Walter von der Vogelweide explored courage, honor, mercy, and rivalry. They praised Christian valor, but they also described worthy Muslim foes. Epic song, courtly tale, and lyric prayer became a cultural archive for crusade and for the empire that tried to guide it. At court, the image of the warrior king stood at the center. Frederick Barbarossa used chivalry to bind his ministeriales and lesser nobles to a shared identity. When he took the cross at Mainz in 1188, the old ideal of the Miles Christi felt newly alive. Yet this was also a response to social change. Good cavalry was costly. Knighthood was rising as a class with its own needs and symbols. Ceremonies, pageants, and vows helped turn private honor into public duty. Later, rulers did not always control this bond. Frederick II's uneasy place within crusading culture shows how fragile the link between empire, chivalry, and holy war could be. In the end, crusade and empire fed each other. On the battlefield in 1190, Barbarossa's war cry joined royal ritual to holy purpose. The spirit of imperial crusade spread beyond one dynasty. It moved through chronicles, sermons, songs, and city records. It also drew on fears, hopes, and ambitions far from the royal court. The emperor might lead, but he did not own the meaning of the crusade. Much work remains. We still do not fully grasp how high death rates among nobles changed politics at home. Networks of power around courts, bishops, cities, and great families need closer mapping. We need clearer links between what poets imagined and what soldiers and preachers did. The story of Jewish communities in German crusades must be told with greater depth and care. New methods from the social sciences may help connect these strands. Crusading was costly in men and money. Medieval rulers knew this and pressed on. They believed the goal outweighed the price. For them, to fight for the Holy Land or to carry the cross to the Baltic was both duty and privilege. The clash of faith, rule, and war did not yield a tidy system. It produced a rough balance of ideals and interests, lifted by devotion and pulled by faction. That tension shaped German crusading for generations, and it kept alive the conviction that the highest prize must be approached with both prayer and the sword. The Crusades in Eastern and Northern Europe reshaped the borders and the soul of medieval Christendom. They were not only wars of conquest, but also missions to spread a faith that had already been moving eastward through preaching and diplomacy. Long before the armies came, monks and priests had tried to convert pagan peoples peacefully. But when persuasion failed, rulers and warriors turned to force. These campaigns, later called the Northern Crusades, were different from those in the Holy Land. They were not about reclaiming lost Christian lands, but about converting and conquering new ones. Some were never formally blessed by the papacy, yet all shared the same conviction: to fight those seen as enemies of Christendom. The movement began with the German push eastward between the Elbe and Oder rivers in the 10th century. New bishoprics appeared, and missionaries worked among the pagan Slavs known as the Wends. Across the frontier, local rulers like Mieszko of Poland accepted baptism, bringing their people into the Christian world. One by one, the monarchs of Bohemia, Hungary, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden followed. But many tribes, especially along the Baltic coast, resisted. They attacked missionaries, burned churches, and rejected the faith of their neighbors. By the early 12th century, this resistance became a call to arms. In 1108, a document known as the Magdeburg Charter urged Christians to fight the Wends, calling it a holy duty. It described them as savage pagans who defiled churches and oppressed believers. Warriors were told that fighting them was both a path to salvation and a chance to win land. Although no immediate campaign followed, the idea of a Christian war for conversion had taken root in Northern Europe. The conquest of Pomerania by the Polish ruler Bolesław III showed what this new kind of holy war looked like in practice. His campaigns combined politics, faith, and force. After subduing the Pomeranians, he sent Bishop Otto of Bamberg to convert them, backed by soldiers and threats of renewed invasion. Otto used ceremony, wealth, and persuasion, not just preaching, to win converts, earning him the title Apostle of Pomerania. Yet beneath the peaceful surface, the message was clear: accept baptism or face destruction. In the following decades, the crusading idea spread north and east. The Teutonic Knights arrived in Prussia, taking up arms against the last pagan peoples of Europe, the Prussians, Livonians, and Lithuanians. Their wars erased entire cultures. The Prussians disappeared. Their name survived only as a German title. The Lithuanians endured by accepting Christianity and joining Poland in a political and religious union. These were wars that brought the cross to new frontiers, not through pilgrimage, but through conquest. The Crusades of the Baltic and the Slavic lands forged new Christian kingdoms, reshaped old pagan societies, and carried the reach of Western Christendom to the edge of the known world. In the lands of the North, crusade and conversion went hand in hand. Poland's Piast rulers looked to Prussia as both a mission field and a frontier to expand. They drew inspiration from the martyrdom of Saint Adalbert, who had died preaching to the pagans centuries earlier. In 1147, after the Wendish Crusade, Duke Bolesław IV led an army deep into Prussia. Chroniclers described the campaign as a holy war, meant to save souls as much as to conquer land. The Prussians were told to accept baptism or face death. Yet the new faith did not take root, and Polish princes returned again and again, fighting more wars of conversion in 1166 and 1192. By the late 12th century, the crusading idea spread across the Baltic. Denmark launched attacks on the Wends and Estonians. King Valdemar I destroyed the great pagan temple at Arkana in 1168 and forced conversion on the islanders. Missions followed war, often protected by knights from Denmark, Sweden, and Germany. In Livonia, Bishop Meinhard began his mission around 1180, building a small Christian base on the Duna River. His successor, Bishop Albert of Riga, founded the city of Riga and created the Order of the Sword Brothers, a band of warrior monks sworn to defend the faith. Their campaigns turned Livonia and Estonia into new Christian frontiers under the authority of both Pope and Emperor. Meanwhile, in Prussia, Polish Cistercian monks continued the old mission. With papal approval, Bishop Christian of Prussia led efforts to convert the pagan tribes and defend the new believers. But as the region grew unstable, more military strength was needed. In 1226, Duke Conrad of Mazovia invited the Teutonic Knights, a powerful order of crusading monks from the Holy Land, to settle and defend his border. The Teutonic Order quickly seized control of the mission. They took over Christians' lands, absorbed the smaller local military order known as the Knights of Christ, and soon ruled Prussia directly under papal authority. By the end of the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights had crushed most resistance. Prussian culture and language disappeared, and the land became a Crusader state. The wars then moved on to the Lithuanians, the last pagans in Europe. In the late 14th century, the Lithuanian ruler Jogaila converted to Christianity and married the Polish queen Jadwiga, uniting their realms. This alliance ended the Teutonic justification for holy war, but the knights remained, ruling their state until 1525, when their Grand Master broke with Rome and created a Protestant duchy under Polish rule. The Northern Crusades brought vast regions of Eastern Europe into Latin Christendom. What began as peaceful missionary work became an unending cycle of conquest, conversion, and colonization. These wars blended faith with ambition, holy struggle with dynastic power. They forged the map of Northern Europe and left a legacy that shaped politics, religion, and culture for centuries to come. In the spring of 711, the Arab governor of North Africa, Musa ibn Nusayr, sent a force across the strait to southern Iberia under his Berber commander Tariq ibn Ziyad. Earlier raids had tested the coasts, but this time the goal began as support for one Visigothic faction in a bitter power struggle. Events moved fast. King Roderick rushed south from a campaign in the north, and in July, his army met the newcomers near the heights west of Tarifa, not far from the rock later called Gibraltar. The Visigothic host broke and scattered. Roderick vanished from the record, likely killed in battle. Rivalries within the Visigothic elite, especially after Roderick's contested election, helped turn a limited intervention into a sweeping collapse of royal authority. With resistance shattered, Muslim commanders advanced quickly. Tariq moved inland and took Toledo. Musa soon crossed with Arab troops, secured Seville and Merida, and joined Tariq. Town after town accepted agreements rather than fight. Local nobles kept their lands, status, and churches in return for loyalty and taxes. This policy matched earlier Arab conquests in Syria and Egypt and suited both sides. The newcomers were few in number, and the local elites wanted to preserve their standing. A famous example is the pact with Duke Theodemir of Mercia in April 713. By the mid-720s, most of southern, central, and eastern Iberia was under Muslim rule. Only the far northeast and beyond the Pyrenees held out for a time, but even there, key cities like Narbonne, Carcassonne, and Nimes eventually fell, creating the northern edge of what people soon called Al-Andalus. The 8th century set a course that shaped Iberia for centuries. Muslims dominated much of the peninsula for 300 years, then held roughly half of it for 2 more, and finally maintained an emirate in Granada until 1492. No other region of Latin Christendom fought Muslims so persistently or for so long. Later ages built national myths around this struggle. Some emphasized permanent conflict, others spoke of shared life and culture. Modern debates about Reconquista and Crusade reflect these competing memories. Yet it is clear that Muslim power mattered deeply to medieval Iberia, and that Christian kingdoms expanded mainly by conquering parts of Al-Andalus, guided by social needs and by ideas that gave their wars meaning. 19th and 20th century writers often framed the medieval wars as a single sacred mission to recover a lost Visigothic Christian unity. That view shaped politics in modern Spain and sometimes labeled the Civil War of the 1930s a crusade. Later, historians tried to link Iberian campaigns to the wider crusading movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, pointing to papal support and shared religious aims. Others argued that before those papal calls, Christian-Muslim relations in Iberia were more pragmatic and restrained, and that harder religious lines only arrived with outside influences. But religion was present in Iberian conflicts long before the First Crusade, and local motives were powerful. Ideas of restoration and holy war grew from Iberian soil, even as rulers later used crusading language to strengthen their cause. What truly drove expansion was the balance of social strength and political cohesion on both sides. Christian societies in the north matured over time, building stable structures that could support frontier settlement and war. Opportunities widened when Muslim power fractured. The fall of the Cordoban Caliphate and the rise of many small Taifa kingdoms opened the way to the great conquests of the 12th and 13th centuries. When strong North African empires crossed the strait, Christian advances slowed. When those empires weakened, the frontier moved again. Across 7 centuries, the rhythm of war followed these shifts, while the guiding idea of restoration adapted to each age. The story begins with survival in the north. After 711, Muslims held the former heartlands of the Visigothic realm. Mountain zones and borderlands resisted, much as they had resisted Rome and Toledo before. In the northeast, Frankish power pushed the Muslims from Septimania and created counties that would grow into Catalonia. In the northwest, the Asturian kingdom slowly gained strength. By the 9th century, kings and counts in both regions forged their own religious and political visions and seized ground when Muslim unity faltered. From these roots came the long expansion that later generations called the Reconquista, a native, evolving program that mixed faith, power, and opportunity, and only sometimes wore the cloak of crusade. In the late 8th and early 9th centuries, King Alfonso II of Asturias changed the course of the Northwest. The small Christian enclaves stopped showing deference to Córdoba and began to act on their own. society became more stable and more organized, and a new royal ideology took shape. The court broke with the southern Mozarab tradition and built a distinct religious identity. Oviedo rose as a new royal center where churches and royal halls stood side by side. New bishoprics and monasteries reshaped the church map. Northern clergy rejected ideas tied to Toledo and pushed for independence. The growing cult of St. James gave the Asturian Church an honored link to the apostles and added prestige to the young kingdom. These changes had real consequences on the ground. In the mid to late 9th century, the frontier jumped from the Cantabrian Mountains to the wide valley of the river Duero. Ordoño I and Alfonso III advanced west, center, and east, taking places like Oporto, León, Zamora, and Burgos. Two facts made this possible. The Duero zone had been thinly held since Berber forces pulled back a century earlier, and Córdoba was weakened by serious internal revolts. Stronger society in the north met a divided south, and the map moved. Court writers gave this movement a clear story. From the 800s, royal chronicles said that the Christians were heirs of the Visigoths and carried a duty to restore what sin and defeat had lost. This restoration idea later became known as Reconquista. It did not drop from the sky. It grew from social life and belief, and then was shaped into text. Religion stood at the center of war and peace with Islam long before outside influences. The notion that only Cluny or later Crusades brought a hard religious edge to Iberia does not fit the evidence from the 9th century north. In the northeast, the Carolingian counties followed a different path at first. They were more urban, used Frankish administration, and faced Muslim neighbors who often fought among themselves. As Frankish control faded, local counts took full charge. While their chronicles came later, their rulers likely shared a similar restoration outlook as they dealt with frontier pressure and noble power. When their own histories were written, they showed the same attitudes toward Muslim neighbors that we see in Leon Castile. Power swung again in the 10th century. The Córdoba of Abd al-Rahman III and the caliphate that followed were strong. Christian realms went on the defensive. Later, the warlord Almanzor led deep raids into the north. These did not change borders much, but they kept pressure high until his regime collapsed. Around 1031, the caliphate broke apart into many small kingdoms. Christian polities, now more cohesive, seized the chance. They advanced when they could, and, just as important, they forced Muslim states into vassalage and tribute when conquest was not the best option. Both paths served the same goal: restore Christian lordship over Iberian lands. Many later stories start with Barbastro in 1064 and argue about crusade. The deeper truth is simpler. Barbastro, like other campaigns, fit long Iberian strategies. Aragon pushed east. Urgel looked beyond the mountain rivers. Leon Castile aimed to secure the Duero and then step south to a major city, which they did with Toledo in 1085. Tribute from Muslim states and military action worked together. Medieval power was about people and payments as much as walls and fields. Vassalage could expand a king's dominion just as surely as taking a city. Across the 12th and 13th centuries, great rivers marked the steppes: the Ebro, Tagus, Júcar, and Guadalquivir. Cities like Zaragoza, Tortosa, Valencia, Córdoba, Jaén, and Seville fell in turn, often when Muslim unity cracked. Crusading language and outside knights sometimes added energy, and popes issued calls that raised prestige. But the main engine was native: a mature society, a clear royal ideology of restoration, and careful use of conquest or submission as conditions allowed. That is how the frontier moved, century after century, until only Granada remained. By the 1230s and 1240s, the Christian kingdoms of Iberia reached their greatest expansion. King James I of Aragon and King Ferdinand III of Castile and Leon led powerful campaigns that changed the map of the peninsula. The Balearic Islands, Valencia, and most of Andalusia fell into Christian hands after the Almohad Empire collapsed and Muslim unity broke apart. The defeat at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 had already weakened Muslim power. One by one, cities surrendered. Jaén was taken in 1246, and Granada's ruler, seeing no other choice, became a vassal of Ferdinand III. Seville resisted but fell in 1248, marking the end of Muslim control over most of southern Spain. Yet the Reconquista was not only about conquest, it was also about restoring Christian rule, sometimes through submission and alliances. Granada's vassalage, lasting for nearly 2.5 centuries, was part of this system. The Christian kings sought both power and stability, often preferring tribute and loyalty over direct annexation. Still, their main concern in the following years was the control of the Strait of Gibraltar. This narrow passage was the only link between Muslim Spain and North Africa. Step by step, Castile took key ports like Cadiz, Niebla, Algeciras, and finally Tarifa. The decisive Battle of El Salado in 1340 ended the danger of North African reinforcements. Although some have called it a crusade, in truth it was part of the long Reconquista, a native struggle that sometimes used the language and symbols of crusading for moral strength. After the victory, Alfonso XI captured Algeciras in 1344, but his death during the plague in 1350 stopped the campaigns. Civil wars and dynastic struggles followed, and attention shifted away from Granada. Only in 1410 did Ferdinand of Aragon, then regent of Castile, resume war and take the city of Antequera. Still, a full conquest of Granada would not come for another 70 years. When Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs, came to power in the late 15th century, they brought a new vision. Their aim was not just to recover lost lands, but to build a unified Christian state. Religious and political unity became their guiding principle. The idea of Reconquista, once about restoring the old Visigothic realm, now served a new purpose: the creation of a single, centralized monarchy. By the time their armies entered Granada on January 2, 1492, the Reconquista had truly ended. It was no longer only a medieval restoration. It had become the foundation of a new era. The war for Granada blended the old spirit of holy war with the modern ambitions of statecraft. Papal support gave the campaign the blessing of a crusade, but for Ferdinand and Isabella, it also brought prestige and financial aid. Soon after their victory, the Pope granted them the title Catholic Kings. The Reconquista, born in the mountains of Asturias centuries earlier, had finally completed its long journey, turning a divided land into a united Christian kingdom standing at the dawn of modern Spain.